Christmas had always been my favorite time of the year. The soft glow of fairy lights on the tree, the aroma of roasting turkey mingling with cinnamon and pine, the laughter of children, it all used to fill my heart with warmth. But this Christmas was different. This Christmas would leave a scar on my pride, one that no amount of festive cheer could heal. I arrived at my daughter's house carrying a small gift bag, my favorite old winter coat, and my ever-present hearing aid, snugly fitted behind my ear. At 68, I had grown accustomed to the soft hum of background noise, the slight echo of my own footsteps, and the subtle vibrations of life that only a hearing aid could bridge for me. I never minded the device. It was a small price to pay for staying connected to the world. Or so I thought. From the moment I stepped through the front door, I sensed an unusual tension. My daughter greeted me with a quick, perfunctory hug. My son-in-law, Greg, gave me a nod, his eyes briefly lingering on my hearing aid. That lingering look should have warned me, but I brushed it off. After all, I was there to see my grandchildren, to share a meal, and to enjoy a quiet, joyful evening. Dinner was set beautifully, a roasted turkey glistening under the chandelier, mashed potatoes steaming softly in their bowl, and cranberry sauce reflecting the candlelight like tiny rubies. I took my seat at the head of the table where I had always sat. My daughter sat beside me, smiling politely, while Greg settled across from me, his phone casually flicking through something as if he were disinterested. Then it happened. Greg leaned slightly forward, the corners of his mouth curling into a smirk that immediately made my stomach churn. "Hey, Dad," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Did you bring your, super hearing aid today, or is it still on the fritz?" The words hit me like a blow. I froze, the silverware in my hand trembling slightly. My heart raced, and for a moment I wasn't sure if I had heard him correctly. My daughter laughed nervously, a laugh that tried to mask embarrassment, and said, "Dad, it's just a joke. Don't take it seriously." Just a joke. I looked around the table. My grandchildren giggled quietly, exchanging mischievous glances, unsure why the adults were laughing. My son-in-law's smirk widened as if he had landed a perfect strike. I wanted to speak, to defend myself, to remind them all that mockery wasn't acceptable, but the words refused to come. They lodged somewhere in my throat, heavy and unyielding. Silence enveloped me, heavier than any Christmas night I had ever known. It wasn't just the quiet after the joke. It was a suffocating, isolating silence that seemed to echo every past humiliation I had endured quietly in my life. The laughter of others, light, teasing, harmless to them, felt like sharpened knives cutting into the very core of my dignity. Greg didn't stop. He continued, leaning back in his chair, clearly enjoying the discomfort he had created. "I mean, Dad," he said, his tone dripping with mock sympathy, "you really need to keep up with technology. These old devices can't even handle a simple Christmas dinner without making you look like, well, you know." "You know" was a sentence I'll never forget. Those two words carried more weight than any insult could. They painted me as outdated, weak, and laughable. My daughter's attempt to diffuse the situation, her soft, "It's okay, Dad," only made me feel more invisible. Invisible and yet painfully exposed. Pain isn't always physical. Sometimes it is an emotional eruption that leaves you gasping for air, trapped in a room full of people who don't, or refuse to see your suffering. That night I felt it in waves, a searing, sharp pain that cut through every memory of respect I had once commanded in my family, pain that gnawed at my self-worth, pain that made me question every step I had taken to raise my children, to support my family, to live an honest life. I tried to smile, a weak, broken smile, the kind that hides internal turmoil. I told myself this isn't worth a fight, don't give him the satisfaction. But inside, the humiliation festered. It wasn't just the mockery, it was the subtle, sinister pleasure he took in highlighting my age, my vulnerability, my dependence on a device that was meant to connect me to the world. I felt small, minuscule, invisible. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur. Greg continued with occasional jabs, each one more pointed than the last, but now I had mastered the art of silence. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply endured, my knuckles white as I gripped the edge of the table, reminding myself that this silence was mine to own. It was unbearable, yes, but it was also a quiet rebellion. As the children chattered about toys and school, my thoughts spiraled. I remembered the early days of my marriage, when I worked long hours to provide a secure home for my family. I remembered the sacrifices I had made, the evenings I had spent alone in a quiet house, ensuring that my children had everything they could ever need. And now here I was, mocked by a man who had only entered our lives a few short years ago, someone who had not witnessed the struggles, the victories, the endurance that had defined me. Pain is a teacher, they say. That night, it taught me humility, endurance, and the power of observation. I watched Greg smirk, cataloged every gesture, every glance, every sneer. I saw the way my daughter flinched slightly, the subtle tremor in her voice as she tried to maintain peace. I noticed the silent exchange between my grandchildren, their confusion and curiosity mingling with an instinctive sense of discomfort. And in that pain, in that humiliation, a seed was planted, a seed that would grow quietly, unseen, until the time came when it would bloom into something undeniable. For now, I endured. I bore the weight of mockery, the sting of ridicule, and the quiet ache of betrayal from those I loved. When dinner finally ended, I excused myself, moving slowly to the living room, my hearing aid buzzing faintly as if sympathetic to my distress. I sat in the corner, wrapped in the soft glow of the Christmas lights, feeling both shattered and oddly alert. The world had shown me its cruel side that night, but it had also revealed a truth I could not ignore. The power dynamics had shifted. My silence was not weakness. It was a strategic withdrawal, a pause before action, a calm before a storm that only I could orchestrate. Pain had been inflicted upon me, yes, but it was also a revelation. It showed me the cracks in the facade of familial harmony, the insecurities masked by laughter, and the vulnerabilities of those who believed that mockery could wound me forever. Little did they know, the pain they had caused was only the beginning. And so I sat there, a silent observer in my own home, feeling the sting of every word, every glance, every derisive chuckle. The world had turned cruel in that living room, and I had been left exposed, humiliated, and deeply, painfully aware of the fragility of respect in the hands of those who wield it carelessly. But beneath that pain, a quiet determination began to stir. A promise, unspoken but unwavering, that the scales of power were not fixed, they could be shifted. And when the time came, the laughter, the mockery, and the false sense of superiority would be met with something far more profound. Tonight pain had been served, but pain is patient, and so am I. The following days felt heavy, a cloud that hovered over my every thought. But Christmas wasn't over. There was still one final gathering my family had planned, a brunch with extended family and a few close friends. I thought, foolishly, that maybe the daylight, the presence of others, and the soft hum of casual conversation would dilute the sting of Greg's ridicule. I was wrong. From the moment I arrived, I realized this wasn't just a family meal. It was a stage, and I, unwittingly, had been cast as the punchline. Greg had invited a few friends over, men who were equally young, equally brash, and equally eager to establish a hierarchy of dominance. My hearing aid, which I once considered a private tool of independence, had become a public spectacle. "Dad, you still wearing that thing?" Greg asked loud enough for several people nearby to hear, his grin sharp and deliberate. "You know, it doesn't make you cooler, just older." The laughter was immediate, a ripple through the room, not the gentle, polite chuckle of someone acknowledging a joke, but the kind of laughter that isolates and humiliates. I could feel the weight of their eyes on me, the silent judgments echoing with every peal of laughter. My daughter tried again to intervene. "Dad, don't mind him," she said quietly, but her voice lacked conviction. She was torn, caught between loyalty to her husband and love for her father. I caught the flicker of guilt in her eyes. but it didn't mask the fact that Greg's mockery had already drawn the room into his orbit. I smiled, a thin, controlled smile that didn't reach my eyes. Inside, I burned. Public humiliation is a cruel, sharp blade. It isn't just about embarrassment, it's about power. When others watch you falter, when they see you diminished and laugh at your expense, it's a profound shift in control. And in that room, Greg was wielding it with precision. He didn't stop at the hearing aid. The mockery became a slow, deliberate performance. "I hope you've got it fully charged this time," he said, his voice theatrical. "Last Christmas, it nearly exploded when you tried to hear the carol music." The room erupted in laughter again. I could feel the heat rising in my face, a mixture of anger, shame, and disbelief. My grandchildren, who were present, looked on in confusion. Did adults always treat each other this way? Were families supposed to humiliate one another for amusement? Their innocent eyes pierced through the mask I tried to maintain. I picked up my napkin, pretending to dab at a non-existent spill, careful not to let Greg see my trembling fingers. Each laugh felt like a needle, threading humiliation into the fabric of my pride. My daughter's soft words, "It's just a joke," had become an empty echo. A joke, yes, but one at the expense of respect, dignity, and years of patience. Then came the worst moment. One of Greg's friends, clearly emboldened by the social momentum, leaned in with a mocking whisper that I could just hear, thanks to the subtle amplification of my hearing aid. "Man, your father-in-law's gadgets are almost as old as him," he said, smirking at Greg, who chuckled in agreement. The laughter was louder this time. It wasn't just Greg's performance, it was now a chorus. I sat rigid, controlling my breathing, my mind racing. Public humiliation has a unique sting. Alone, you can bear pain. In private, ridicule can be ignored or countered with silence. But in front of others, in front of a room full of people who now see you as diminished, weak, and laughable, that's a cruelty unlike any other. I thought about walking out. I thought about confronting them, about slamming my fist on the table and demanding respect. But I didn't. I stayed. I endured. Every chuckle, every sarcastic remark, every condescending glance, I cataloged it all. Every moment of mockery was etched into memory, every ripple of laughter feeding a fire inside me that no one could see. Greg finally leaned back, satisfied with his performance. He had clearly orchestrated it to perfection. The timing of the jabs, the audience participation, the careful pauses to let the laughter build. I realized then that this wasn't just cruelty. It was strategy. He had tested the waters of power, and the room had responded exactly as he had predicted. But humiliation, while sharp and wounding, also sharpens observation. I watched how people reacted, the quick glances away, the subtle discomfort in a few faces, the half-smiles that hid judgment of the mockery itself. Some were laughing at the surface, but their eyes betrayed unease. I noted every reaction, every hesitation. Each was a thread I would remember. Each was an opportunity to understand the structure of this social battlefield. When the brunch finally ended, I excused myself, moving to the quiet outside in the chilly winter air. I felt the sting of humiliation in every muscle, every nerve. The laughter, still echoing faintly from the room, followed me like a ghost. Pain had been inflicted publicly now, in front of family, friends, and strangers alike. The exposure had magnified the original sting tenfold. Yet even in that bitter moment there was clarity. Public humiliation is not the end of power. It is a test of endurance. It is a revelation of weaknesses, both in those who wield mockery and in those who receive it. And as I stood there, the cold biting my cheeks, I realized one profound truth. Humiliation is only as permanent as you allow it to be, and I would not allow it to be permanent. I returned inside, moving quietly, unnoticed, my eyes scanning the room. Greg was laughing with another guest, oblivious to the storm that had begun to form in me. My daughter avoided my gaze, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of fear. The children were quietly whispering among themselves, sensing the tension that the adults pretended didn't exist. Public humiliation had shifted something fundamental. It had laid bare the weaknesses, the arrogance, and the dependency of those who had mocked me. And more importantly, it had begun to awaken a dormant strength within me, a strength I had cultivated over decades of life, struggle, and endurance. The fire of determination was kindling silently in the background, invisible to everyone else. That night I went to bed with the memory of laughter ringing in my ears, not the warm laughter of Christmas cheer, but the sharp, cutting laughter of humiliation. I replayed every moment, every glance, every snicker, and with each replay I allowed the anger and shame to transform into focus. For the first time, I realized that the story was far from over. Public humiliation had given me something I could not have anticipated: perspective. I could see the structure of relationships, the hierarchy of mockery, and the predictable behaviors of those who relied on ridicule to assert control. And in that clarity, a plan began to form, a plan as silent and calculated as the mockery had been loud and chaotic. Pain had introduced me to humiliation. Humiliation had opened my eyes. And now, silence, my quiet endurance, would become my weapon. Tomorrow they might see me as small, weak, and laughable, but one day they would see the consequences of their arrogance. One day the balance of power would shift, and when it did, the public spectacle of humiliation would be reversed. The laughter that had once stung would echo back upon them, in a form far more precise, controlled, and undeniable. Tonight I endured. Tomorrow I planned. And in that planning I found the first seeds of strength, the subtle, unwavering power of someone who has been humiliated but who refuses to remain defeated. Public humiliation had sharpened my mind, focused my resolve, and revealed the path forward. And I would walk that path patiently, deliberately, until the day when laughter would no longer wound me, but instead return to those who had unleashed it with such careless cruelty. The days after that humiliating brunch were eerily quiet. I returned to my routines, to my small, measured life, but the echoes of laughter, pointed glances, and whispered mockery lingered like shadows. I noticed how Greg carried himself around the house now, confident, smug, expecting my submission. He believed the narrative was set, that I was weak, that I could be diminished with a few cruel words and a public display. He was wrong. I decided then that I would not engage in petty arguments or impulsive confrontations. No, silence would be my armor, patience my weapon. Every laugh he drew from others, every smirk directed at me, would be observed, stored, and understood. In the quiet corners of the house, in the private stillness of my mind, I began to watch the patterns, how he moved, how he spoke, how he manipulated my daughter and the children with charm and subtle authority. Silence is powerful, darling. It is often underestimated. People who mock and belittle thrive on reaction. They feed off it. Their sense of control grows when they see pain, anger, or fear in their target. I gave them nothing. No outburst, no tearful surrender, no acknowledgement beyond a polite nod or a quiet smile. At first my daughter noticed. "Dad, are you okay?" she asked one evening, her voice tinged with unease. "You barely say a word around Greg anymore." "I'm fine," I said softly, watching her closely. "Just thinking." Thinking, yes, I was thinking. About patterns, about weaknesses, about the cracks in Greg's carefully constructed facade. Silence allows one to listen, to observe, to understand. And what I understood was critical. He relied on arrogance, charm, and intimidation. Remove my reaction and the power he thought he had begins to waver. Over the next few weeks I perfected this strategy. At every family gathering, at every casual remark or sly jab from Greg, I responded with nothing. Not anger, not humiliation, not even acknowledgement. My daughter, initially anxious, slowly adjusted. The children began to see a different side of me, a calm, steady presence that contrasted sharply with Greg's performative energy. Even Greg began to notice. He tried to provoke me. "Dad, are you even listening?" he asked during a game night, expecting the familiar spark of irritation. I merely smiled faintly, holding my composure. The air between us shifted imperceptibly, but shift it did. His confidence, once so blatant, now flickered. His smirks were slightly delayed, his laughter forced. Silence had become my unseen ally, and with it, power began to shift. Public humiliation relies on spectacle. It demands a reaction. Take that away and the audience, the family, the friends, the children, begin to question the dominance of the mocker. People start to notice inconsistencies, cracks, and the true strength of the silent observer. One evening, as we all sat around the living room after dinner, I noticed Greg leaning back, attempting another jab. He said, "You know, Dad, maybe you should let me handle the tech stuff. You're clearly struggling." The words hung in the air, but I offered nothing. No nod, no response. I simply looked at the grandchildren who were quietly coloring at the table and then back at the window where the last remnants of sunlight reflected off the frost. Greg's smirk faltered. His audience, the family, watched closely, and a subtle tension began to replace the laughter. My daughter glanced at him, eyebrows raised slightly, the silent question of his behavior now forming in her mind. Power is often misunderstood. Many think it is loud, forceful, visible. True power, however, can be quiet. It is patience. It is control. It is the ability to withstand mockery, to observe the weaknesses of others, and to let them unravel themselves. And Greg, in his arrogance, was unraveling. I began to implement subtle reminders of my presence, not through confrontation but through competence. Simple actions, a meal prepared with precision, a piece of advice shared calmly and wisely, an unexpected gesture of understanding toward my grandchildren demonstrated authority without arrogance. People noticed. The children began to defer to me naturally, seeking my guidance and comfort. My daughter began to lean on me more, realizing that her husband's confidence was not infallible. And Greg? He became increasingly agitated, attempting to reclaim attention and control, only to find the room's dynamics shifting against him. There were small victories at first, almost imperceptible. A joke he made that fell flat, a suggestion ignored by the family, a smirk that was met with polite silence instead of affirmation. Each instance chipped away at his assumed dominance. He relied on spectacle, and I had removed his audience's response. The power was shifting quietly, inexorably. Even my hearing aid, once a source of embarrassment, became irrelevant. Greg's attempts to mock it were ignored. No one laughed. No one joined in. The ridicule had no energy, no life, no power over me or the room. The device, a symbol of vulnerability in his eyes, had become neutral ground. It was no longer a tool for him to assert superiority. Weeks passed. Silence became a habit. Endurance became a strength. Greg's arrogance began to erode in subtle but undeniable ways. His comments were less frequent, his jokes less sharp, his smirk less confident. The room, once charged with tension and ridicule, now held a quiet, balanced energy. I had not struck, I had not humiliated, I had not even confronted directly, but the power had shifted. One evening, my daughter approached me, her voice low and hesitant. "Dad, I think Greg," finally seeing that he can't just walk over you anymore. I smiled faintly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Sometimes the greatest strength is patience," I said. "People reveal themselves when you don't react. You just watch, wait, and let the truth come forward." And the truth had indeed begun to emerge. Greg's control, once taken for granted, was no longer assured. His public persona, the confident, dominant figure, was subtly cracking. And I, in my quiet endurance, had initiated a transformation in the family's perception. Silence, darling, is more than mere absence of speech. It is a tool, a weapon, a shield, and a strategy. It allows the observer to see the vulnerabilities of the aggressor, the cracks in their confidence, and the true nature of relationships. By refusing to react, by maintaining composure, I had begun to reverse the power dynamic without lifting a finger. That night, as I sat alone in the study, reflecting on the days of quiet observation, I realized something profound. The humiliation that had once wounded me now served as fuel. The laughter that had echoed cruelly through the dining room had become a map, guiding me towards strategy, patience, and eventual justice. Every smirk, every pointed remark, every snicker was noted, remembered, and stored, not for retaliation and anger, but for a calculated reckoning that would one day restore balance. The power shift was subtle yet unmistakable. I no longer feared Greg's mockery. I no longer flinched at his arrogance. The room no longer belonged to him, and in that quiet reclamation of control, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, a sense of quiet triumph. Silence had given me strength. Humiliation had sharpened my focus, and now the power, once wielded by another, was quietly returning to me. And when the time came for the next move, it would not be loud. It would not be chaotic. It would be precise, undeniable, and irreversible. The shock of what was to come would leave no doubt who truly held the power. For now I remained quiet, observant, patient, but the tide had already begun to turn. The opportunity came unexpectedly, yet perfectly timed. Life has a way of handing you moments that, if prepared for, can become instruments of justice. And after weeks of silence, observation, and careful calculation, I was ready. It was another family gathering. This time, a winter-themed dinner at my daughter's house, the kind of festive evening where laughter should flow freely, and the warmth of family is shared in abundance. Greg, unaware of the storm quietly brewing beneath my calm exterior, arrived with his usual arrogance, confident in the social dominance he thought he wielded. He greeted me with a smirk that had once been so unbearable, unaware that the dynamics had changed entirely. The children ran past us, decorating the tree, oblivious to the tension that now hummed beneath the surface. My daughter offered me a seat at the head of the table, her eyes meeting mine with a mixture of relief and caution. She had noticed the subtle changes in Greg, how his jokes no longer landed with the same impact, how his confidence had begun to waver. The evening began innocuously enough. Toasts were made, small talk carried out, and the aroma of roasted meat and baked desserts filled the room. Greg, sensing an audience, attempted a light jab early on. "Dad still managing that hearing aid?" he asked, loud enough to catch the attention of a few guests. A grin spread across his face, anticipating laughter. I merely smiled, not the thin, strained smile of before, but a composed, measured smile that radiated calm. Silence. The first reaction came not from me, but from the room itself. Guests exchanged glances. The laughter that once immediately followed Greg's remarks no longer came. The shift was subtle, but it was undeniable. Greg's confidence faltered. He tried again, more forcefully this time, leaning toward my daughter with a whispered, "Don't you think your dad's behind the times?" And that's when I struck. Not with anger, not with humiliation, but with precision. I leaned forward calmly and deliberately and said, "Perhaps, Greg, it's not the device that's behind the times, but the understanding of respect that seems to elude you." The room froze. Conversation halted mid-sentence. The children looked up, curious. My daughter's eyes widened slightly, a mixture of shock and relief, and Greg's smirk vanished. His face went pale, the first real crack in his facade. "Excuse me," he stammered, attempting to regain composure. "You heard me," I said softly, firmly. "You have spent weeks mocking me in front of everyone, assuming your words would harm me. But your arrogance blinded you to one thing: patience and observation give power. And now it's clear that the respect you thought you commanded has quietly shifted." The room went silent. Not a breath, not a laugh, not a whisper. Every eye turned toward him, and suddenly the spotlight was on Greg. He was no longer the dominant figure. He was exposed, vulnerable, and caught completely off guard. Guests began to murmur. My daughter, seeing the change, added quietly but firmly, "Greg, maybe it's time you consider how your words affect people. Mockery isn't strength, it's weakness." Shock registered fully on Greg's face. He opened his mouth, closed it again, fumbling for a reply that wouldn't come. He had miscalculated entirely. The quiet, patient endurance I had practiced over weeks had not only protected me but had orchestrated this exact moment of reversal. I could see it in the small, involuntary movements, the tightening of his jaw, the twitch of his fingers, the faltering of his usual confident posture. The power dynamic, once dominated by his cruelty, had shifted irreversibly. My words were the final nudge, the precise culmination of a strategy built on patience, silence, and observation. The humiliation he had tried to inflict on me now mirrored back on him, but not in the form of mockery or revenge that could be dismissed as petty. No, this was justice delivered quietly, elegantly, and with undeniable clarity. The room understood the reversal. They saw the arrogance falter, the control crumble, and the respect restored, mine, and the family's collective acknowledgement of what true dignity entails. Greg tried to recover, attempting a weak laugh, a shrug, a casual remark, but it failed. The room no longer responded to him with validation. The spell he had woven with ridicule over weeks had dissolved entirely. I had not shouted, not retaliated physically, not attempted to belittle him in return. I had simply waited, observed, and struck with words when the time was right, in front of an audience that now recognized the subtle truth of the situation. The children, sensing the tension, looked between us, confused but aware that something had changed. My daughter's expression softened toward me, her eyes reflecting gratitude and a quiet pride. This was not vengeance in the petty sense. It was moral justice, a lesson wrapped in patience, strategy, and dignity. Greg finally muttered something incoherent, his arrogance drained, his performance over. The shift was palpable. The power that once seemed so firmly in his hands had migrated, quietly, irreversibly, to me. And in that moment, the humiliation he had inflicted upon me no longer had any power. The cycle had reversed. I sat back, calmly sipping my drink, observing the remnants of the storm. The room was still charged with a new energy, a respect that had been absent in the weeks prior. Greg's attempts to regain dominance were futile, his previous laughter now a distant memory echoing only in his mind. Shock revenge, darling, is not about rage. It is about precision. It is about timing, patience, and exploiting the natural weaknesses revealed through arrogance and cruelty. And in that room, in front of the family and friends who had once watched my humiliation, the balance had shifted entirely. I had been the target, but I became the architect of resolution, the master of a quiet, undeniable justice. When the evening ended, I quietly gathered my coat and gift, leaving the room with the same calm demeanor I had maintained all along. But the change had already taken root. The seeds of respect, of authority regained, and of moral justice had been planted. Greg's arrogance had been deflated, and the subtle social hierarchy now recognized the shift. I left the room with a sense of satisfaction deeper than any moment of fleeting victory could have offered. There was no shouting, no chaos, no petty mockery returned. Just a quiet, unassailable triumph, born of patience, endurance, and the clever orchestration of timing. Shock revenge had been delivered, not for humiliation but for restoration. The balance of power once tipped by cruelty had been returned. And as I stepped into the crisp winter night, the glow of the Christmas lights behind me, I knew that the lesson had been clear, and the moral justice had been quietly, yet firmly, enacted. The days following that winter dinner were different. The air in the house had subtly changed, the undercurrent of tension replaced by a newfound respect. Greg no longer attempted to dominate conversations or belittle me with jokes. He moved cautiously, aware that his previous methods of asserting control had failed, and that the family now recognized a quiet but undeniable authority in me. It was moral justice at its purest, not loud, not vindictive, but firm and clear. The humiliation he had once inflicted, which had cut so deeply into my pride and confidence, had transformed into a lesson, observed and internalized by all who had witnessed it. My patience, my silence, and my composure had turned the tables without a single outburst or confrontation. Even my daughter, who had once struggled between defending me and protecting her husband's ego, began to see the truth more clearly. She approached me one afternoon, her eyes reflecting both relief and gratitude. "Dad, I can't believe how calm you were," she said softly. "You didn't lash out. You didn't make a scene, but somehow you taught him a lesson he'll never forget." I smiled, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Sometimes justice doesn't come from anger or force," I said. "It comes from patience, awareness, and letting people reveal their own weaknesses. And when they do, the world notices." The children, who had been silent observers, began to treat me with renewed respect. They sought my guidance more often, asked for my advice, and seemed to sense that the calm, patient authority I now embodied was more powerful than any loud reprimand. It was humbling, and yet deeply satisfying. Greg's behavior shifted as well. No longer did he try to assert dominance through mockery or sarcasm. Every attempt to control or belittle me was met with calm observation, polite dismissal, or gentle redirection. He learned quickly that his tactics no longer worked, and that true authority was not granted by fear or ridicule, but by consistency, patience, and moral strength. I realized that moral justice is not only about correcting wrongdoing, but about restoring balance. It is about demonstrating to those who think power is only about control, mockery, or intimidation that true strength lies in dignity, composure, and resilience. And when the family witnessed the reversal, not in anger, but in quiet confidence, they understood that justice had been served. There were moments, quiet and unspoken, when Greg would attempt a joke or a sly remark, only to pause as the weight of observation and expectation bore down on him. The laughter that had once followed him like a shield for his arrogance had vanished. He was forced to see himself through the lens of his own failures, and it was a subtle, yet profound, reckoning. I also noticed a shift in the family dynamic. My daughter no longer felt torn between her father and her husband. She now understood that respect must be mutual, and that mockery or cruelty cannot be tolerated in any family. The children, witnessing the reversal, internalized an important lesson about dignity, resilience, and the power of patience over impulsive reaction. The moral justice I had enacted was not about vengeance or humiliation. It was about teaching a lesson that would endure beyond the moment. Greg had been shown the consequences of arrogance and cruelty, not through retaliation, but through the demonstration of calm authority. The family, the children, and even friends who had witnessed the events understood the value of patience, observation, and measured response. One quiet evening, as the family gathered for a simple meal, Greg approached me with a tentative expression. "Dad, I may have misjudged you," he said, hesitating. "I realize now I shouldn't have mocked you." I looked at him steadily, seeing sincerity, unease, and a subtle understanding of the lesson learned. "Thank you," I said simply. "Acknowledgement is the first step toward respect, and respect is what every family should hold sacred." No further words were needed. The shift had already occurred. The balance of power, once tipped unfairly, had returned naturally, quietly, and irrevocably. Greg learned humility, my daughter learned clarity, and the children learned the value of dignity and composure in the face of cruelty. Moral justice had been delivered, not with vengeance, not with humiliation, but with patient strategy, calm authority, and unshakable dignity. It was a quiet, enduring justice that left no scars except those of awareness, understanding, and growth. That Christmas, and the days that followed, taught me something profound. Humiliation may be inflicted, power may be challenged, and pain may be felt deeply. But patience, silence, observation, and composure can transform suffering into strength. They can restore balance, command respect, and deliver justice in a way that lingers far longer than anger or retaliation ever could. As I watched my grandchildren play in the living room, laughing freely without fear or tension, and my daughter moving confidently between her roles as mother and mediator, I felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The lesson had been learned not just by Greg but by the entire family. And that, darling, is the essence of moral justice. It is quiet, enduring, and transformative, leaving those who sought to harm powerless and those who endured elevated. That Christmas, I learned that strength does not always roar. Sometimes it waits, it watches, it builds silently, and when the time is right, it asserts itself with clarity, precision, and undeniable authority. The echoes of laughter that once humiliated me were gone. In their place, respect, balance, and understanding remained. And that, more than any festive celebration, more than any gift, more than any spoken word, was the true triumph of the season.